A gentle sum filled the air at a jewellery store in Portland, Maine. A glossy cover lined the walls, showing rings, necklaces, and gems sparkling under strategically placed lights. Each piece seemed to hold a story. It is a whisper of elegance that has been waiting to adorn a person's life. Ruth entered the entrance and placed her worn leather industry on her shoulder. She was in the late 1970s. Her silver curls were appropriately under the hat in the basket. She looked around with a familiar smile, and her dark eyes recorded displays she had seen many times before. Ruth's son Eric poured his heart into the store and transformed him into one of the most admired places in the city. Every time she went in, she was proud of her pride and knew that her boy had built this success from scratch. Ruth came today to surprise Eric. It was a routine from you every few weeks. She went back without notice and brought him lunch from his favorite cafe. She had weaknesses to these visits and observed how he interacted with his clients and saw him in his elements. But today it was Eric outside. A brief message from a reception employee said he was coming back for a meeting with a new supplier and would be back soon. Ruth doesn't bother him. She was able to easily search the display and let her hike her thoughts. As she went down the aisle, her fingers lightly stroked the glass case, feeling the warmth that came only from the familiarity of many years. Her eyes drifted into the specific sentences of diamond earrings. They reminded her that she had years ago before life had her sold her. For a while, I watered the flicker of nostalgia. Ruth was in my mind and saw the earrings fascinated by her brilliance. She only moved slightly, her fingers smashing into the glass. But then it slips a little. Her fingers rayed the edge of the stand. One of the earrings capsized and fell to the floor in a gentle chunk. Ruth's heart skipped the blow. She leaned slowly, carefully in her movements, causing the scene even if no one had noticed, which made her feel embarrassed. A few sharp heels clicked onto the floor as she picked up the earrings. Ruth looked up and blinked, as a strict seller bigger than her stand. The woman who didn't recognize Ruth didn't have to be in the store and had an unreadable expression. Despite this, Ruth caught a cold in her gaze. There was no sign of warmth or familiarity she was used to at this place her son had. However, Ruth wiped it out and tried to explain it when she stood up. "Sorry, dear. I wanted to see it carefully. These earrings remind me of a couple that once said." The woman gave her no chance. With the appearance of Ruth pierced, the seller crossed her arms and looked at her with a look that maintained more than mere disapproval. The seller's voice was sharp and cold, and it swept through the air like glass. "What do you think?" did she ask. I asked in her and her eyes as she stared at Ruth. Surprised, Ruth straightened and kept her earrings high. "I accidentally dealt with it." She began to make her voice stable but soft. "I just praise it, and I have it." Her tone dripped with light empty, praised the seller for the interruption. "You mean putting it, isn't you?" The accusation was hanging in the air, heavy and choked. Ruth's breath caught in her neck. "A stack? That's ridiculous. I never have." However, the woman did not listen. Her eyes ran through loose, flickering with her modest coat and her weathered wallet and her expression, taking some cruel things. People like them do not belong to such stores. She was calm, but toxic, overshadowing the implicit bias, and Ruth felt like the blade had been cut off by her. Ruth's hands let out an earring and trembled as his voice stopped. "I think there was a misunderstanding." The saleswoman approached and grabbed Ruth's hand with the shocked force. "Save your excuses," she snapped. "I'll call the police." Ruth's heart hit her chest. The mere absurdity of the situation turned her head. "A police? This is not necessary," she pleaded. "I did nothing wrong." The seller ignored her protest and began to pull out her phone and select it. When she spoke to the dispatcher, her voice was futile. "Yes, "We need a Golden Grace jeweler officer. I caught someone who tried to steal a diamond earring. She was still here, and I arrested her." "I've been imprisoned," Ruth whispered in front of him. She took a step back and captured the straps of her handbag, as if she could do earth in the chaos swirling around her. The next moment was blurry and developed. Ruth barely registered the sound of the entrance or the fast, heavy stages of the two officers entering the store. Both men were big, their uniforms were crisp, and their expressions were indecipherable. They approached the cellar, and the seller immediately began the theater event. "This woman," explained the seller, and showed Ruth his fingers accusing him. "I had to stop her before she could escape." Ruth's hands trembled as she tried to speak. "I didn't try to steal anything," she said. Her voice fluctuated. "It was an accident. Please, I'm the owner's mother." The officers replaced the appearance, but their attention remained to the seller. One of them turns to Ruth. His gaze is fierce and impersonal. "I need you to move forward." Ruth took a step closer and his knees weakened. "Please, that's a mistake," she said. But her voice was barely a whisper. Before she could say another word, the officer grabbed her by the arm and pulled her to the side. She stumbled at the sudden strength, and she frowned as she turned her hands behind her back. "What are you doing?" called Ruth. Panic flooded her voice. The cold metal in the handcuffs turned my wrists, and the noise seemed deafening. Ruth was frozen and shocked to move. Tears ran into her eyes for anyone who could help her, looking around the store, looking for a friendly face. But there was no one. Only the seller looked with a chuckle at the victory. "I hadn't stolen anything," Ruth said, and her voice broke as tears dropped her cheek. "You make a mistake." One of the officers spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. "You can explain yourself at the station." The words met them like a blow-off, knocking out the air from their lungs. At the station, Ruth lived long and faced a share of challenges, but was never dealt with. The humiliation was unbearable. She felt like a criminal, despite her not doing anything wrong. Officials led them to the door, their handle company, and their inexplicability. Ruth's mind raced. Everyone thought he was more desperate than the last. She didn't understand how it would happen. This was her son's shop, and a place she always felt safe. What about the nightmare? When they reached the threshold, voices surged from throughout the room. "What the heck is going on here?" The official took a break, and Ruth turned his head towards the source of his voice. Her mind leaps up as she stood at the door, his expression of a mixture of confusion and anger. Eric freezes for a moment before moving forward. His tailor for a meeting with the supplier was slightly crumpled as if he had cut back. His jaw was tight as he picked up the scene, and his movements moved quickly and intentionally. His mother was handcuffs and tears, officers hold their arms, and the sellers are accompanying each other. "Take this from her," Eric ordered, his voice deep, but was accused of almost modest rage. The officer cleared his throat and moved uncomfortably. "Sir, we responded to the theft complaints." "Take it off," Eric repeatedly. All the words were cut and accurately cut. His dark eyes burned as he approached and switched to his mother. "Are you okay, Mom?" His sound was a little soft, but his hands were clumsy to his side. Ruth nodded weakly, her voice trembling. "I did nothing, Eric. I dropped the earrings." Eric turns to the seller. His expression looks like ice. "Mr. Ner, would you like to explain why you thought I would call the police?" Miss Turner hung up for a moment, apparently not ready. "Sir, I didn't know she was your mother. She dropped the earrings and it—" "Well, I thought she was going to do it." "Did you think?" Eric snapped. His voice rose slightly. "Was it a thief who gave you the right to take over my mother from anyone?" I didn't mean that Miss Turner was stammered. Her confidence had collapsed. "I tried to protect the store." Eric pushed out a sharp, humorous laugh. "Do you protect the store from your mother? Do you have any ideas about what you did?" You didn't just humiliate her. You have humiliated me, this business, and everything we stand for." He pointed to Ruth, who was still shaking. "Look at them. Does she look like a thief for you?" Mr. Ner's mouth opened and closed as he fought for answers, but there were no words. Eric turned to an officer who still didn't need to remove the handcuffs. "Are you just serious about being there?" The officers replaced the uncomfortable appearance. One of them finally stepped forward and removed the cuffs. As soon as Ruth's hands were free, Eric was by her side and gently rubbed her wrist. "Sorry, Mom," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have gone through it." Ruth shook his head, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how I got it so far." Eric grew up, and his anger rose again as he spoke to the room. "This is now over," and his gaze was on Miss Turner. He said, "You shot. You don't need people like you who represent my business." Miss Turner's face turned in the ashes. "Teacher, please." "I didn't know. I don't mind that," Eric interrupted. His tone is cold and final. "Oat. Now." Her hands trembled as she messed with hers and rushed at the door, avoiding all her eyes. Eric turned to the next officer. "And two of hers. You owe my mother an excuse. She was humiliated enough for a day." Officers glow awkwardly. The protocol was pursued based on complaints. Protocol? Eric fought back, his voice dripping incredibly. "Is your protocol handcuffing older women to older women without examining the truth? Are you calling protection and services?" The officers remain silent and are appreciated for previous trust. Finally tweeted, "Sorry, Ruth looked at her. Her expression was unreadable. She just nodded before Eric leads her to a chair near the counter. "Sit down, Mom," Eric said gently with his hand on his shoulder. "I take care of everything." Eric returned to the officer when Ruth sank into his seat. "You can go now. We will file a formal complaint about how this was addressed." Officials heed and went to the door before they nodded a little, marking a departure from an unpleasant silence. Eric kneeled next to Ruth, his voice soft. "AC Mint, do you need something?" Ruth shook her head, her hands resting on top of him. "I just want to go home." Eric sucked a mixture of relief and persistent frustration that washed himself away. "I'll go right away. But first, I'll make sure this never happens again." The next day was a hurricane of phone calls, statements, and legal proceedings. Eric wasted no time filing official complaints against officials and denounced Mr. for the attacks he had in his mother's attack. Ruth shaking, but she supported her son's decision. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about someone else to endure the same humiliation. The news quickly spread. Once known for his elegant reputation, the Golden Grace jeweler was now at the heart of a passionate conversation about bias and accountability. Although customers have expressed support for Eric's actions, some have been troubled by this sort of mitigating Mr. Eric was stubborn. "I have no room for this kind of action in my business," he told a local reporter. "And there shouldn't be any space for that." In the meantime, Miss Turner faced her own claim. The video materials for business surveillance cameras remained without question what had happened. The entry recorded her attack, blows, and apparent refusal to listen to Ruth's explanation. He also revealed the rough treatment of Ruth by the officials who continued to be angry. Miss Turner appeared to be shaking visible in court. The confident, cold behavior she showed in the store is gone. Now she looks small and vulnerable, her hands shaking as she sits at the defense table. Prosecutors systematically explain the evidence to allow film material and witnesses to draw clear pictures of their actions. Ruth didn't need to testify at Eric's claim. He knew that experiences in front of strangers were too much for them. Instead, the prosecutors were based on videos and statements by police officers who admitted they acted too quickly. "Your entry was a bit of a victory, but it didn't erase the pain she caused." During the course of the experiment, Ruth felt a strange mix of emotions. She was grateful for the support she received from Eric and the community, but the incident left her with a trace that her judgment could not be deleted. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the stab wounds of a blow, hearing the lump of handcuffs and seeing the disapproval of strangers. The Jew apprentice only reported it a few hours before returning, unanimously determined. He is guilty of all charges. Miss Turner was convicted of assault and honor damage, and the judge ruled that included community service and force sensitivity training. Reporters Eric and Ruth raved about them outside the courthouse building. Eric said with confidence that his words of someone's weight had decided to make a difference. This isn't just about what happened to my mother. Standing next to him, Ruth spoke quietly, but with the same conviction. I lived a long life, she said, despite the crowd. And I saw it too. But I believe in my son, and I think we can do it better. We must do. The crowd muttered as the camera flashed and caught the moment he felt personally and universally. Ruth's resistance and Eric's resolve transformed moments of injustice into a call for change. A few days after my judgment, I was thinking about it. Not only was it a feeling of closure. For Ruth, torture left a scar, but she also strengthened her resolve. Eric, a constant guardian, made sure his mother was surrounded by love and support. Friends and family often visited, bringing warmth and laughter back to their lives. Golden Grace Jeweler has also made a major change. Eric introduced a new training program for his employees, focusing on equity and cultural sensitivity. He held workshops to community leaders and ensured that his business had become a place where everyone was respected and welcomed. The business call began to recover and was reinforced by Eric's transparency and commitment to getting things right. For Ruth, life slowly returned to a new normalcy. She resumed her weekly visits to the store, and now she is greeted with even more warmth from her employees and customers. The incident had changed her, but he hadn't broken her. If it had at all, it made it stronger. One afternoon, when Ruth sat in her son's office and drank tea, she looked at Eric with pride. "You did that well," she said quietly. "There are not only stores, but also appropriate entries." Eric smiled, his hands resting on her. He said, "You have taught me everything I know about resistance." Outside the store, the community was gathering, inspired by the story. The debate about bias and accountability was more common not only in Portland but in nearby cities. The story of Ruth and Eric sparked conversations that went far beyond their small town. As Ruth prepared to leave the store that day, Eric went to the door. It had the sun on it and threw a golden glow down the street. Ruth took a break, took a vision, and turned to his son. "I know that wasn't easy," she said. "But they made something terrible with meaning. This is how the change is happening." Eric nodded, his gaze being thoughtful. "And it's not finished yet. There's still a lot to do." Ruth smiled, her heart filled with a calm, hopeful feeling. "Son, son." When she left, the bell above the door once gently scribbled the everyday sounds, but now she remembered like memories of resistance and progress. Ruth knew that the world wasn't perfect, but she also knew that change was possible. A step, a story, one after another, courageous act.